the history of Kavatha Castle and how it turned into a museum and art gallery is not a quick and easy history, but to get it across fully, really, I have to get a bit into the history of how the building itself was created. And in general, Kavatha Castle was obviously home to the Crochet family of ironmasters, really. And I'll flick almost immediately over to my PowerPoint now to show you a picture of the gentleman who was responsible for the building of Kavatha Castle. And there we go. And so, yeah, William Crochet, the second, as we call them, just because there's lots of Williams and it gets very confusing a lot of the time between all the Williams, Roberts and Richards. But yeah, William Crochet II was responsible for building Kavatha Castle primarily. And it wasn't an easy thing for him to achieve at all, because at the time in the early 1820s, when preparation to build Kavatha Castle was in full swing, the iron industry was not doing that well at all. In fact, coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, the iron industry was doing pretty poorly in Merthyr on every level. It was not really as strong as it was in previous years by any stretch of the imagination. And so the amount of money needed to build and construct and lay out a place like Kavatha Castle and the park and the lake and the greenhouses and all the things that are connected was a massive undertaking, really. But William was quite committed to doing it. Now, the reason why is kind of his own, really. We don't know massive amounts as why he was so adamant, but he was living and had various homes like Gweld Garth House in Merthyr and a few other homes elsewhere in the world. But he really wanted a family home in Merthyr overlooking the ironworks to really go to town on putting the family's footprint firmly there, outdoing all the other ironmasters' homes, because Kavatha Castle was one in a long line of ironmasters' homes, really, and certainly wasn't the first, but it was 100% the most over-the-top and ostentatious and really, you know, just a ridiculous thing in many ways to build this castle building on top of a little hill looking down over an ironworks. So it stood out a mile, really, and it still does today. And it always amazes me how people come from far and wide sometimes to Wales to see Kavatha Castle, thinking that they're going to get a proper castle, and then they see this inside, they see this very ornate Georgian, early kind of Victorian family home. And so they're often not disappointed, thankfully, but normally it goes okay. But William, his father, William again, William I and William II, his father didn't want him to build Kavatha because he felt on two things. He felt that it was too expensive for the time because the iron industry was doing so badly. And secondly, he didn't want the people of Merthyr to have some sort of symbolic place to rebel and rally against. And that's coming off the back of a few different riots and uprisings for the workers in 1816 in Merthyr. And so it was quite a tumultuous time in Merthyr Tydfil, and they were keen not to have something that's such an over-the-top expression of wealth, really. But William basically went and did it anyway. He borrowed money to do a lot of it and went against his father's wishes and bought the land that Kavatha Castle now sits on. And it's another strange thing about Kavatha is Kavatha is known as Place of Barking or Barking Place. And it's named after where the ironworks was. That ground is said was ancient hunting ground where dogs were heard barking. I've also heard of another explanation, because where Kavatha Ironworks was an old quarry. A very ancient quarry, and when they built it, it would echo and reverberate the sounds of the dogs going through. So that's another little thing that I've heard and picked up over the years as to why Kavatha was named Kavatha. But it was certainly connected to hunting dogs and hunts. But then over the other side of the river was where Kavatha Castle and Park would be laid down. But the name of that place was actually Pandy Place. It was named after the Pandy farm, which is still standing now. But Kavatha wasn't known as Kavatha at all until the Crochets built Kavatha Castle. And what I mean by that, because it confuses me no end, is geographically Kavatha is over one side of the river, but because the Crochets wanted to keep that connection alive, when they bought the land that was known as Pandy Place, they renamed it Kavatha Park and renamed it Kavatha Castle, essentially. And now the original name of the place and the farmland, Pandy Place, has been all but forgotten, and it is known as Kavatha, even though it's not. Technically, Kavatha is where the ironworks is. But anyway, digressing, which will happen a lot. But let me get back to showing you some of the PowerPoint in it. So William Crochet is said to have spent around £30,000 on building Kavatha Castle. Now, when it was being built, it was said locally that there was a lot of attention put on it. It wasn't named yet, but it's often remarked, and by local people doing letters and articles in the newspapers, that they were interested in the progression of the big house, they called it. And it was all started being built in 1824, finished in 1825. And they called it simply the big house. The big house is progressing, it's being built and all that. But when that figure, 30,000, is put out there, it is kind of almost not really fully going to grips and not fully getting to grips with the amount of money that was clearly invested in it. Because 30,000 was, as we understand it, the basic building cost of that building. And so if you look at this image by Penry Williams now, which hopefully many of you can see, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, images of Kavatha Castle as it was just being finished. It is in fact not even fully finished in this image, and there was livestock in the park and things like that, and overlooking rather the ironworks. But the building itself cost 30,000. That's not taking into account the furnishings, the fixture, the fittings, the carpeting, the curtains, and then the other things in the park, the lake, the greenhouses, and all these other things. Now, what I'm showing you there is the earliest floor plan we have from the architect. Now, for anyone who walks through Kavatha Park regularly and looks at the heritage plaque attached to the building outside Kavatha, you might not realise the mistake that someone drastically made at some point in history, long before I worked there, so there's nothing to do with me. But they named the architect Richard Luger on the heritage plaque, and it's actually Robert Luger. They got his name horribly wrong, and hopefully we'll change it at some point. But Robert Luger designed the building, and this is the earliest known layout of that building that we've got. And it contained, as you can probably see from this image, it contained a dairy, a brew house, there was libraries, several drawing rooms, billiard rooms, hot and cold food storage. It was literally everything you can imagine a proper gentlemanly stately home to be, really. And yeah, it was just incredible on every level. And as I mentioned just now, elsewhere in the park you would have had hot houses, and this is a picture taken from the top of Kavatha Castle looking towards the back, where they have long been destroyed now, the majority of them, but they are the greenhouses of Kavatha Castle and Park, and they would grow grapes by the ton. It said only white grapes, no red grapes, but it was the head gardener. I live at the moment, and I'm going to tell you this, I'm hoping none of you will stalk me, fingers crossed. I live in Cefn, just on Holford Street at the moment, and literally on the end of my street, opposite the end of my street, is an old house, a large house. It's 154 High Street, Cefn, and in that house, the gardener, the head gardener of Kavatha Castle and Kavatha Castle greenhouses and hothouses and gardens lived. That was the house that was bought for whoever the head gardener was. And at one point, the head gardener that lived there literally bent his whole mind to create a perfect grape with no spots on it. Literally, you wouldn't believe the amount of years that this guy spent trying to produce a perfect grape with no spots. He never achieved it. And so when you're shopping and you're picking up green grapes in the shop and you see one that's got no dots on it because of genetic modification or anything like that, feel a little bit sorry for this poor gardener. Mr. Betjeman, his name was. But yeah, he lived here, and along with many other gardeners, and they grew pineapples and they grew all manner of fruits and veg. The pineapple thing is crazy, because the museum I work for many years, actually for many decades, had as the logo a pineapple, and people were like, why a pineapple? Because Kavatha grew pineapples, and for decades when the Crochets lived there, Kavatha Park was known far and wide for the pineapples that it was producing. It used to produce gigantic 12-pound pineapples, believe it or not. And the average pineapple is about 2 or 3 that you pick up in the shop. So these were gigantic ones on every level. And so, yeah, so the greenhouses and the hothouses available that were at Kavatha Park were a big thing, really, massive thing. And as you can see in this photo, they're actually constructing a brand new one just on well, you can just see it outside of the back. I'm trying to work out whether you see the left or the right of this picture, but I'm getting confused by it myself. So yeah, they're building and constructing a brand new greenhouse. So they were extending, and this photo was taken in the mid-1870s. This floor plan is a little bit more familiar to us who work in the museum now, because a lot of the rooms that we occupy now as a museum and art gallery are the exact footprint, really, of this side of one side of the building. This floor plan was actually taken in 1909 when the council bought Kavatha Castle. Now, to just go back to my face a second, give me one sec. I'll stop screen sharing. So, Kavatha Castle is a weird thing because it's so synonymous with the Crochet name, but they lived in it for a very tiny period of time. It was finished, as I say, in 1825, but the family literally abandoned it by 1889. So a tiny amount of time they lived there. And why they abandoned it is because William Crochet II grew tired of the iron industry, and he lost a son in Merthyr, and in general was getting older, so he distanced himself from the on-site managing and went down to another home in London. In Caversham Park House is still standing now. It was the home to the BBC World Service for a great many years. I'm not sure if they still own it, but again, to showcase the wealth of William, though, when he moved into Caversham Park home, it burnt down not long after he purchased it in 1838, and it totally burnt to the ground, and he built it back exactly as it was, practically brick for brick, which is a gigantic amount of finance invested in that. But I'm sure the BBC are thankful for that finance investment there, but he was very much living down in Caversham in Berkshire. And so in Merthyr, the family home was left relatively without the head of the household. So then another head came in, Robert Thompson Crochet. I'll show you a picture of Robert now. And a lot of the videos and a lot of the stuff that I've been doing online lately have always come back to Robert, because he seems to be the most well-known, and obviously he's the crochet who spent the most time in Kavatha. And this is a floor plan of what Robert did to Kavatha Castle. And so Kavatha Castle was, certain rooms have been totally altered and changed. There's an addition of a photographic studio right here, and certain other rooms and extensions were made. The main office, which is now our wedding room, is here down as the gun room. And the child's indoor and outdoor playing rooms, which when William lived there was an indoor child's playing room and a child's school room. They have all been replaced by other buildings and things like that. They also added a fernery, which for those of you who've been to Kavatha Castle, now this is where our cafe is. And a fernery is essentially an indoor greenhouse, really. So you'd go in there and lots of exotic and native ferns and plants would be grown. And so you'd walk out of the main castle and go into the fernery. But now, obviously, if you come into the museum, you go through the main entrance hall and you can pop into the cafe there. It's a very different footprint as well we're in now, which I will get to in a second. But the upper parts of the building as well are something that definitely needs noting, because strangely for Kavatha, the second floor only existed over one side of the building. So what I mean by that is, if you look at this square of the building here, this is the only side of the building that had a second story to it, and even slightly higher than that actually in some spaces. Like this area here has 4 floors. But that was the only side that had 2 floors and above. The school side, which we'll get to, had none. It was all one level. And so this side here was all one level, and it was all the wash house, the dairies, the bakehouse, where the harness room was, the barns, where they kept the coaches and horses and things like that. So very much, when you look at Kavatha from the outside, pretty much half of it is not technically part of the house. It's serving the house and the family in some way, but this squared part of the building is the main house. That's where everything predominantly was, from the servants' hall and the bedrooms above and the kitchens and the billiard rooms and everything like that. There's also a basement gallery, which contains my favourite fact, which I never miss an opportunity really to talk about in whatever I'm doing, because it always astounds me in every way, is the wine cellar and basement area that they created was worth more than the entire house and contents when it was sold back after Robert Thompson Crochet died. It was a ridiculous amount of money this wine cellar was worth. There were over 15,500 bottles of wine, of port, champagne, whiskey. It was a crazy amount of stuff going on down there, and obviously it was all long gone by the museum took over it, which is sad beyond belief, but it is what it is. But yeah, so Robert Thompson Crochet took over Kavatha Castle, and then eventually what would happen is that his sons would take over as well. His sons would come in and they would essentially take over the mantle of Kavatha. But his eldest son, William Crochet, again, William Thompson Crochet this time, took over the house, but he already at the same time inherited Caversham Park House. So there was a tiny amount of years overlap between 1879, where Robert Thompson Crochet died, to 1889 when they sold the house, when they left the house rather, and that's when William Thompson occupied it, but he wasn't really fully committed to the building. He had Vayner House, which is long gone and would have been quite near where I live now originally, but essentially he decided to spend his full time down in Caversham. And weirdly, no members of the extended family really wanted anything at all to do with Kavatha. And that mainly stems down to the one thing, is that their main interest in the town, the business and the industry, had really died down by then. The ironworks had been open and closed so many times, it's ridiculous. And they were desperately trying to sell parts of it on, convert parts to steel making. They were trying to make a go of it after Robert Thompson died, but essentially it wasn't working. And so what they ended up doing was just leaving the town and concentrating on other interests, being in the stock market, being in the coal industry elsewhere, being in other industries. And so nowadays, the Crochet family themselves is just spread far and wide. There are still some based in Wales, but in general, in the museum at least, we get crochets coming from everywhere. We get Scottish crochets, German, Australian crochets, Irish crochets, everyone comes there, and they all, you know, my family owned this house and all that type of thing, but they've literally spread out far and wide really. But none of them were too interested in taking on Kavatha Castle and Park. So what the family did in 1889, they basically closed it and stripped it of everything. So the wine cellar was stripped, the carpet, because the whole building was carpeted throughout. They took it all. They took the curtains. They even took some of the chandeliers that existed in the building. They left some, but then took others, and they literally left it as a total blank canvas. But then very shortly after they left, you talk in less than a year after they left, people in Merthyr were already pushing to buy it off the Crochet family and turn it into a museum and art gallery. Now, the reason why they were doing this is because several years previous, around that same time frame, most of the middle classes and notable townspeople in Merthyr were desperately underwhelmed by how little cultural buildings and things to do in Merthyr existed. They wanted to really make an impact in Merthyr in terms of putting an art gallery, putting performances on, doing all these types of things. And so the drill hall, the old drill hall in Merthyr, which is still standing at the end of Brecon Road, that was often utilised for talks, for lectures. People like Arthur Conan Doyle came there and lectured in the early 20th century, along with a great many other people. You know, people like Keir Hardie was often lecturing there as well. But not only that, they opened art galleries there. They opened fetes there, and they used these public buildings to do an all manner of different things, really. And so eventually they were getting a bit kind of upset that all the work and hard effort they were doing had to be taken down because some other event was coming into the drill hall or another building they were using. And so they were really keen to get a permanent place where whatever work they did in terms of putting an art exhibition on or putting an exhibition of historical objects on, whatever they were doing was there permanently to make an impact on their town. Because it often fills me with a great deal of pride, to be honest, working in Kavatha Castle, because it was the collection there and the whole motives behind the people of Merthyr setting this up were really pure. They genuinely just wanted people to experience art and culture and history in a physical way, in a physical environment, not just read it in a book or not just see it anywhere that they, you know, randomly and then never experience it again. Actually physically get up close to art and history in some meaningful way. And so in the early 1880s, they put on in the drill hall a gigantic exhibition of Merthyr, a gigantic exhibition in Merthyr that was all art related, and it was absolutely huge. I have done a video on that before, and I'll big that up at the end. But essentially, it was the prototype of what Kavatha would be, that exhibition, because most of the things contained within that exhibition would eventually come to Kavatha Castle, because a lot of the donations and a lot of the artwork was donated by people connected to Merthyr, people who had bought this artwork, people who had bought this ceramic collection, this art collection, this sculpture collection, and given it over for other people to see, and then donated it permanently to Kavatha. But it was a long old road, as you can probably see, and I'll share this image with you now. Stop sharing, hold on. So yeah, it was a long old road to get to Kavatha opening, and this image is the opening of Kavatha Park in June 1909. Now, the local council were basically created a few years previous to this, and one of the first things they wanted to do with Kavatha Castle is take it back, take ownership of it, and turn it into something that would benefit the town's people. And so they, by this time though, it had already seeped into the consciousness of those locally that they wanted to turn it into a school and a museum and art gallery. And the school naturally would get a lion's share of the building just because of the amount of children they wanted to put in that building. And so in 1909, work began converting the building to a school, but it also began to convert certain rooms to a museum and art gallery. And this is why, if anyone's been to Kavatha Castle and also seen the school maybe, you'll see a drastic difference between styles of the school and the museum rooms, because the museum rooms were strictly kind of earmarked to be unaltered, and so they were kept as pure as possible to the original crochet decoration and design, and no work at all, physical building work, was done in the main museum rooms at all, and still hasn't really been now. But then the rest of the building was totally altered and for purpose of the school, really. And so this picture was taken in the park, and the park was open to the public and the museum was open to the public later on in that same year. And what happened later on in that same year is they started doing local exhibitions. Like if you see this advertisement now, this is from the latter part December 1909. And this is basically a local art exhibition, local art and craft work. But they were also doing what we tend to do in the museum now, really. And what that is get a local exhibition and a local artist or a community-based exhibition, and then put that in alongside all of the other permanent pieces or more well-known pieces, if that makes sense. And they were doing that way back when in 1909, really. And the idea was they were going to test the water And so they were deciding to test the water in terms of establishing a museum and art gallery. They weren't sure whether it would work and be popular. You know, exhibitions before had been popular, but they weren't sure whether it would have the staying power. So they opened it up for the end of the year 1909, and it proved so popular that they just kept this exhibition open. And then by April 1910, it was still consistently popular, and they decided to put it as a permanent museum and art gallery and apply for certain government funding and grants to be a proper place where a museum and art gallery would exist forever, really. And yeah, Linda, I'm seeing you as well. You might want to turn your camera off if you could hear me, Tidy. Otherwise, you'll be in the recording. Oh, you panic turning the camera off there. But you're okay. So yeah, so 1910, April 1910 was when the museum was officially opened there. And after that, it would be open permanently until this very day. But the one thing that has always impressed me no end about Kavatha, really, is that its commitment to actually have collections that are relevant and personal to Merthyr Tydfil. And even on the opening program, so the very day we opened, there was a program produced that the museum has, and on the front page it stated 3 rules to consider. And these were the 3 rules they wanted all their visitors to know about and to scream about and to understand. And the first one being, remember that the castle is ours. Let us appreciate and take care of it. And so straight off the bat, it's no longer the Crochet family home. This castle is ours, the people of Merthyr, and let us appreciate and take care of it. The second one is the pictures are not up for decoration of the walls, but for your sake, enjoy them to your heart's content. And now I love that one because often it's a nightmare working in the museum because people genuinely do see the paintings as decoration and they don't kind of tend to appreciate them in certain ways. But this is already starting off the bat saying, look, these pictures are not just decoration. Take your time to look after them and to look at them. And if you are finding that another person in the gallery is not enjoying them as much as you, then try and help them out to enjoy them as much as you are. And the last one is you are requested to enjoy yourselves and help others enjoy themselves as well. And so again, it's just further reinforcing how they want you to really enjoy walking around this building and how people of Merthyr own it. And it's a bizarre thing, really, the over-the-top ostentatiousness of the Ironmasters, namely William Crochet, has never really led to many permanent buildings and structures that we have been able to take advantage of massively. But his over-the-top construction of Kavatha Castle has now given us a building that was a school for over 100 years. There is a museum still going strong for over 100 years. And yeah, and just an amazing architectural building in Merthyr Tydfil. And it's a weird thing. There's not many cases of an ironmaster's home, so a very wealthy person who that home, very few working class people would have been inside and wandering around our room back in the day that it was built. But now those people own it and they do what they want with it in terms of making sure other people enjoy it and take advantage of it. But yeah, so as the museum opened, anyway, it was super successful, as I said earlier. And it was so successful that they kept it open. And in general, the idea behind the collections is the same now as it was then. And what I mean by that is the collections in the museums, first and foremost, they weren't randomly got together. They weren't like randomly shoved together for anyone's sake. This is a photo now of the Red Room in the museum gallery in the 1920s. And most of those objects are still there now. The rooms are nowhere near as packed as they were. Some people don't like that, but trust me, people with prams and wheelchairs do, because you're not getting a pram or a wheelchair through that amount of cases, really. But in general, the museum and the Red Room itself is a prime example of how the collection was given over to the people of Merthyr for very specific reasons. And they are kind of they're more or less twofold reasons. And what the first one is that someone in Merthyr owned something that they firmly believed was of interest culturally or artistically in some way of interest. And they just wanted to pass that interest on to another person in Merthyr. So take, for instance, the Egyptian collection, which I often big up because it's the most kind of clear example of this type of thing that I know of, really. The Egyptian collection is a perfect example because that was collected by a townsperson, a person called Harry Southey, who owned the Merthyr Express. And he was fascinated with Egyptian heritage and ancient Egyptian objects and artifacts, and he brought many back to Merthyr after his voyage through Egypt. He was lucky that he was born in the time that he wasn't stopped at customs for taking a lot of this stuff back, really. But he brought back mummies' heads, hands and feet, along with sarcophagus heads and parts and painted objects, so much stuff. You're talking over about 150 different ancient Egyptian objects he brought back to Merthyr. And as soon as he got back to the town, what he wanted to do was display it publicly. You're talking less than a month after he was back in the town. He was talking to the local library service, which wasn't the building that's there now. It was a paid subscription library in Merthyr, in Thomastown, I believe it was. And he was talking to them about putting on a display of these ancient Egyptian objects. And the reason he specified is many of the fellow townspeople and people that he know haven't got the finances to go down to the British Museum in London and see their collection. So he believes to start in a little mini collection would be of interest and would help a lot of people experience this art and culture from an ancient civilization. And so he put it on display in that library. And then as time went on, the museum was opened, and then that naturally became the house for that collection, and it was passed on to Kavatha to display in the same exact ways. And then on his death, he bequeathed the whole collection, not to Kavatha Castle, mind, he bequeathed it to the people of Merthyr Tydfil. And so if you're from Merthyr, you own some ancient Egyptian stuff, but you can't have it. So yeah, but he gave all that over, and that really is a testament to pretty much a lot of the museum objects that seem quite random, from Egypt, from Japan, from everywhere around the world, really, that a local townsperson saw an interest and had a fascination that he wanted to share and spread on with his other townsfolk. The second reason for the collection in Kavatha is very much that it was created here in some way, shape or form. And so if you were to look at the artwork, for example, the art collection in the museum, particularly the art that's on display, is pretty much by and large created by either Merthyr-based artists, or it depicts a scene or a person within Merthyr Tydfil throughout the 17th, 18th or 19th century. There are certain exceptions to that, obviously, because we've got such a gigantic art collections, but then that falls into the first of those two things in terms of it was given because someone thought it was interesting. And so those two things are really the thread between everything. And so when you look at this gigantic collection of art and objects in the round room here, everything there is thoughtfully donated by a townsperson because it was either created here or because they thought other people would be interested. And it's just an astounding collection on every level, really, really is. I mean, we've still got pretty much all of this on display in some way, even though it looks very different now with modern cases. For those of you who've been to Kavatha Castle Museum as well, this is actually the entrance hall back in the 1920s. It very much, and there's certainly no room for our till area in this picture, but all of this again is still there for some purpose. This steel case in the background here as well, this was actually owned by the Crawshay brothers and was produced by them when they took over the ironworks from Robert Thompson Crochet, who you see in this painting here. And when they took over the ironworks, they converted it into steel, and they wanted to get orders for this new steelworks. And so they created a way to show off what Kavatha iron and steel workers could do. And that is what this is. It travelled the country from 1888 onwards, showing what Kavatha iron workers could do. But then it was also but then it also had additions by the time it came into Kavatha Castle. The additions were things that were attached to the steel arch in London, in Dowlas, sorry. And the steel arch was something that was created for a royal visit in 1912. And so when the royal visit came in 1912 to Dowlas, they wanted something special to show them. So they created a coal arch and a steel arch. And a lot of the objects, particularly the ones on top and these objects here, and a lot of these objects were part of that original steel arch showing the royal family on their first formal visit to Merthyr what people were capable of in Merthyr in terms of iron production. And this is a room that many people who come into the museum nowadays as well say that they miss the Welsh Kitchen and things like that. Well, this is the room that the Welsh Kitchen was in, but obviously in 1920, 23, 24. And it was full of Welsh-related objects and woodwork and spinning wheels and harps and all things like that. And again, pretty much the vast majority of what you see in this room was produced locally and was made locally. We've even got a very unique wicker Eisteddfod chair in the corner there, which we still have today as well. And a lot of these objects are still there in the museum today, modern day. And if you were to wander through the museum, you would see this room looking a bit different, which we'll get to in a second. This is our yellow gallery. And again, the dangerous nature of the hanging of the paintings always freaks me out. But they hang them in this way so you could see the paintings more full on rather than flat against the wall. It's not the way we hang paintings today at all by any stretch of the imagination, because it is highly dangerous to the paintings and really undermines the strength of the frame by having the top end pulling away on the frame and things like that. But all of those images, all of the collection and everything on display was created and curated by Merthyr people for the town of Merthyr, really. And it still goes through right away to modern day. And I'll show you a picture, an example now of modern day Kavatha Castle, because it's a strange thing, really, because I often look back at the history of Kavatha Castle Museum, and sometimes I'm a bit freaked out how I seem to just be repeating history and doing the same type of things that they were doing just 50 or 60 years later, in terms of highlighting a specific collection and redisplaying something interesting and rejigging and researching things. And it's a really weird thing, but it's always been true for the museum that the local interest has always shone above all others, really, and they've really focused heavily. And so the collection now is still continuing to grow and continuing to diversify, but we've still got those two main threads, is that we pretty much really only take anything that has a very significant kind of cultural, impact on some way, but is locally connected. So again, if a local person came and they had an amazing piece of art produced by a Welsh or British artist there, and they wanted to share it with us, just to share it with the people of Merthyr, then we would more than likely take that and display it and add it to the collection. But also, if there's something that's produced in Merthyr, and if there's something that's really significant to Merthyr, then we'll take that and display it at the same time too. And so we very much have still taken those same lessons forward, albeit 100 or so years later on. And so that's another angle of the red room as well, which is packed, and you can see lots of statues by Thomas Brock, and other rooms had local sculptors like Joseph Edwards and things like that. This is a modern day picture, just one I grabbed at random just because it connected a little bit towards what I was talking about. Is when the Crochet, when the castle took in the Egyptian collection from Southey, it was very much all crammed into one or two cases, really. And in 2017, it marked 100 years since the death of Harry Southey, who donated this Egyptian collection. And this is a small exhibition of everything he gave to us, really. And it was the first opportunity we've had to bring everything he donated to us out and put it on display. And you can just see the diversity and scale and size of it. And a lot of this is non-permanent display because we physically haven't got the space yet, until hopefully one day we'll have a bigger and larger space where we can get a lot of things in storage out. But also, oh, there we go. But yeah, the other thing is that we not only are kind of bigging up and going back to collections that have been donated hundreds of years before, we're getting new collections in and going to town and interpreting them. For example, the Hoover factory in Merthyr. So the Hoover factory in Merthyr was a substantial, you know, piece of local history. It was like a second wave of industrial development for Merthyr Tydfil. And so now when you come to Kavatha Castle, you will see remnants of that impact, you know, of that massive washing machine manufacturing going on in Merthyr Tydfil. And just the sheer amount of objects that we've got in connection to the factories of Merthyr and to all the 20th century developments is astounding. I mean, now today we've got, you know, countless objects from Hoover, looking back at that, from button factories, from Kaiserbonda, from every conceivable factory. We've got 2 Sinclair C5s that were produced in the 80s in Merthyr, obviously. And when we're feeling particularly lazy, we ride them around the castle a bit. We don't, I promise. But in general, we've got just so many objects, and we're finding out more and more about them all the time. Because the one thing that I often find about Merthyr is that we fixate a lot, and rightly so, we fixate a lot on our 19th century industrial history, when the castle was built, the Crawshay family themselves, and a lot of the collection in the museum reflects that. But particularly recently, Kelly, our curator, and many other members of staff have been looking at the other major impacts on the town in the 20th century. Like if you look at the Dowlas artist settlement, for example, where in the late 1920s, early 1930s, artists like Cedric Morris came to Merthyr and established an artistic community within Dowlas during the Depression to try and bring some joy and happiness into people's lives through art. And so the people there within that place, the people within Kavatha Castle, were literally bigging up. Oh, would you mind turning your picture off, please? There you go, thank you. And yeah, and the people within Kavatha Castle have now kind of are looking at that art collection and are realising every day we look at them more and more and find out more and more the significance and the impact that that artistic community had on Dowlas and Merthyr in general. And so now we're getting that art out, but not only from established artists like Cedric Morris and Heinz Koppel and things like that. It's also from people who attended art classes and have attended the sessions that these artists were putting on. So we've got sculpted woodwork, we've got paintings, we've got photos and other objects from the people of Merthyr who were creating the art of that time. And again, that's in the collection. And it's insane, the amount of objects that are in the collection of Kavatha. I think in general we have well above 16,000 individual objects, and that is containing everything you can imagine, from a small Roman tile from the Pendarren fort up to a gigantic painting of, you know, the steelworks at dusk. It's just an insane, gigantic collection, and it's a pleasure and kind of privilege really to be working with it and to trying to interpret it and trying to bring people into that world and into that history and see if they are as interested and as fascinated by it as you are, really. But that is pretty much all that I will say on the museum side of things. But I would be kind of remiss slightly of me to not mention the school. And the school opened in 1913, and the school, its connection to the building and the objects and history connected to the school is very much something that is impacted massively on the museum as well. Because as soon as the school opened, they were doing active art lessons in the classes, in the museum rooms. They were doing art lessons within the museum and things like that. And the school was operating until 2014. And so it was a massive chunk of time, really. And the museum's collected and is continuing to collect and continuing to look at the school history and figure out a way to kind of really go to town and tell that story, because 100 years or so of being an open school to all manner of different people who attended there. I mean, I did a video not long ago stating how a person who attended the school in the 1950s or 40s was actually the guy who helped design the Daleks from Doctor Who. I mean, and that's just one random pick. There is so many students and so many creative people that have been produced by Kavatha School in that building in particular. You know, Philip Maddock, Julian MacDonald. Honestly, it's amazing. And we have a collection of objects and a collection of documents really to support that and to big it up. But again, in the future, because I'm guessing at some point someone might ask a question of the future developments of Kavatha Castle, but we are hoping to spread out into the rest of the building at some point and really go to town on a lot of the stories that we are finding out all the time, really. But yeah, I will end there because I'm sure I've gone on long enough, and I'm sure that most of you have got at least to grips with the majority of Kavatha Castle history now. So if any of you have got any questions going forward, really, certainly put them in the chat. I saw one pop up just then, which I'm going to scroll down to now, hopefully. Oh, there's loads coming in now. Oh, that's it. Well, let me deal with that first one first, okay? So let me get to this now. So I'm just opening the chat here now, which is not playing ball. But yeah, new message. So the first question in, I think, was to do with Anthony Bacon, wasn't it? Yeah. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, did Anthony Bacon make Kavatha Castle? It is essentially, Anthony Bacon was long before Kavatha Castle. Anthony Bacon established Kavatha Ironworks and the first furnace at Kavatha back in 1765, which was in full swing by 1766. And then long after he left, Kavatha was built in 1825. He died in 1786, Anthony Bacon. But he did build Kavatha House, which is the predecessor to Kavatha Castle. And that was pretty much where the modern day Mormon church is. That was where Anthony Bacon's home was, and it was known as Kavatha House, which is probably where you've heard the connection to a building called Kavatha. Oh, thank you very much, Karen. She has to run off. So, Hugh Davis, do you have any artwork or material representing life of China? There seems to be very little about it. There is very little about it, in fact. Yeah, there is an astounding lack of information, image-wise, about China. But China has definitely been one of those things that has been a pet project of mine, looking into for donkey's years now. And there is one painting in the collection of Kavatha Castle that depicts the area of China. And essentially, I'm not sure if I've got it to hand now. I will have a quick check. So leave me have a check now, and then I will hopefully have something to show you. But there was a colour image, a painting that was attributed to Penry Williams that we now believe wasn't, in fact, painted by Penry Williams. But that image was created in the 1840s, and it is pretty much the only view or angle that we get of Kavatha, of China. And I'll see if I can just find it quick now, just to give you a quick glance of that. Hopefully I got it hand. I'm sure I'll have it here somewhere or another. It'll be in my, I've actually got a China presentation, so I'll open that up and hopefully be able to show you the image from there now. So give me a sec, I'll leave that start up and I will see if I can share it with you now. And also I am making lots of videos as well. it's all I seem to do at the moment is make lots of videos. But how much of your collection is in storage? Do you rotate material, and do you need more space? 100% need more space. When you've been open as a museum and you're collecting for essentially 100 years or more, then you acquire a gigantic collection. And just take the art, for example. I would say less than a third of our art collection is on display currently, and that's mainly the oil paintings, because they are generally more difficult to store because of the scale and size of them. And so we've got, paintings wise, we've got watercolors, we've got charcoal drawings, we've got etchings, pen and ink drawings, everything in between, and all of those are firmly in storage. Not just because we haven't got space though, is they need finance to actually be framed and displayed properly in some way to actually display them effectively, because a lot of them, there's a famous Welsh, there was a famous, not Welsh, but a famous Welsh based at one time, because he married a Merthyr girl, called Sidney Colonel Vosper. Now, Vosper is remembered for the picture that he painted of Salem with the devil in the shawl and all that. But he donated a massive collection to Merthyr Tydfil, an absolutely gigantic collection. But a lot of that is unframed, unfinished pencils or sketches or pen and ink, watercolors. And so finance-wise, we've never been able really to get it fully furnished and fully ready for display. Parts of it have been, and we've done parts of it wherever we can to get various bits out, but there's still loads that could be done and hopefully will be done in future. My great-grandfather had a flannel mill in Merthyr. Someone said there was a loom in the museum. It is still there. It's downstairs in the basement area of Kavatha Castle, and the basement area is a nightmare of an area for us at a museum, because as years have gone on, the environmental conditions have got worse and worse, and we are looking to move wholesale at some point, hopefully, out of there and get whatever's on display downstairs, upstairs, and properly displayed and taken care of. But fingers crossed that will happen soon, and the loom will be on some other floor, but at the moment it's in the basement galleries and has been on display ever since. I was at the remains of a flannel mill the other day, just near me, in Kevin Coyd in the Trafec and Nature Reserve. Are there any records of who was employed by the Crochets at Kavatha Castle? That's a great question. They may well be in Glamorgan Archives. I know there's records in Glamorgan Archives of people who worked in the ironworks and connected to that. I'm not sure if it extends to the household. Possibly Rhian will be able to help us with that. But in general, the best way I've found to find out about a random year is the census returns. And the census returns, particularly in 1851 and 1861, show a lot of the workers of Kavatha and a lot of the people who occupied those positions within, because when you look at the people who occupied the house, there was 11 or so people living there in the Crochet house, occupying, you know, the positions of butlers, of servants, of waiters and whatever. But then outside you had the gamekeepers, and you had a great many other people as well. So yeah, there possibly are more records. Oh, look at that. I am records from Morley's Castle. There we go. Are there old Welsh newspaper publications accessible online? Lots of stories in public. There are. And if that's the Ian Thomas, I know he knows fully well that there are, because he's delved into them a few times. If it's not you, then sorry. But yeah, there is an amazing resource really for every bit of Welsh history. And I don't quite think the people who created it fully have got to grips with how much they've impacted on local research history, really. The National Library of Wales created a digital online database of most of the old newspapers from the 19th century from all over Wales. Now, previous to this, we were only accessible, national publications were only accessible through paid sites. But the amount of information that's free to access, if you just simply Google old Welsh newspapers and then you have a look, what comes up is the National Library of Wales website, and there are thousands of stories of China, of Ironmasters, of everyone in Merthyr and all the surrounding boroughs and areas. It really is, you can get lost in there for years and not come back up. Oh, there's some pictures of the housing down and the tall house and all that type of thing. Is it true that to be employed in the Crochet household that you had to be Church of England, and some locals converted to get a job in the castle? I haven't heard that myself, so I don't know. I wouldn't think it would be true necessarily, just purely and simply because of the amount of dissenters in Merthyr and the people that I thought it was you, Ian. Hello. Just purely because of the amount of people that were dissenting and going away from the established church, that he would have been hard pressed to find the staff that he needed to that were Church of England. I haven't heard that myself. It's possible, certainly possible, but I know that there were a lot of townspeople that were employed in Kavatha Castle. Take, for example, Abbott, who was the barber, who was gathering information against, who was the accuser of Dick Penderyn back in the Merthyr Rising. Now, Abbott had family and he had several daughters, and his daughters, 2 of them were actually maids at Kavatha Castle. And so there were very much a range of different people from the town involved to work there, but I don't know their religion at all, really. I haven't looked into that, but that's interesting. I will certainly have a look at that. I don't know if anyone else has got any other questions, but I'm going to try to get this image up of China just to show if I can. Oh, there's one image here as well that I'll try to share with you in a second. This image is one that's often been seen in different ways, but that is an image from the Merthyr Express in the 1920s. It was taken a long time before, but it was published in the 1920s. It was actually published in the obituary of D.A. Thomas, who was a Liberal Member of Parliament for Merthyr and went on to be one of the most wealthy industrialists Wales had produced, really. But why this is important is it's showing Pont Storehouse Store, which is this here. But next door to this family shop that the D.A. Thomas family were connected with was the archway that led down into China. And so this is pretty much the only photograph that gets even slightly close to China on Bethesda Street. But I will see if I've got that colour image now that'll show you slightly more in detail, really, because it's an amazing painting in the collection. Oh, where is that house located? It's located what was known on Bethesda Street, but just off from Jackson's Bridge in Merthyr Tydfil. So if you were familiar with where Jackson's Bridge is, it's still standing next to the Wellington pub. And that is where that picture was depicting, really. Let me see if I've got this image now. Give me one sec. But yeah. Give me 1 second. So that's just loading up there. And yeah, sorry, what was the question? There was a pandy clock question there then. That I my chat is updating in a second, so give me a second. It's all gone a bit blank. But I will see if I can get it back up now.
There was a question there, Chris.
Oh yeah.
Are the uprisings in 1816 you mentioned confused with the famous Merthyr riots in the 1830s?
Not weirdly, not many people confuse the two, but they lump them in as one essentially. They don't really tend to differentiate and make aware that they were previous uprisings in Merthyr before 1831. So there was one in 1800 as well, and there was one in 1816. And the 1816 ones were extremely similar in many ways to the Merthyr Rising. It's just it failed to have that really distinctly political kind of edge where they were fighting for rights. And so it's forgotten often, but I would say that more often than being confused, they're often just mention the rising and then lump the history of all the risings for Merthyr in as one. And I've got the image now as well of China, which is great, so I'll share that with you now. And let me share this. So this be here, and I'll get it bigger now. Everything's slowing down on my computer now. So give me 1 sec. I think it's the size of this image that I've shown you because it's in hyper kind of resolution. But if you see here, this is Jackson's Bridge here. And next to Jackson's Bridge is this area here, and that is China. Now, we know it's China because China was described and mapped out pretty specifically in various places. And it was next to the Bethesda cinder tip, which is, you can see coming down. The river is much wider and is massively changed today, obviously. But this area here is known as China. And I think on the next slide, I go a bit in close to it. Oh, there you go. Yeah, and so this is a close-up on that now. And so as you can see, it's below the level of the road, and this is the level of the road. And that building I showed you earlier with the shop front is essentially, you see in the back of it here. So you would enter through the top of Bethesda Street here and then come down into this area. It was prone to flooding all the time. As you can see from that image, it would be a nightmare of a place to live, really. But it was certainly flooding all the time and not a very pleasant place to live at all. Were there any other questions, Rhian? Because my chat is really being delayed here, so I can't see them tidy.
Yeah, there's a question from Hugh Davis. Was China always called that? I've heard it referred to as the cellars before. And why China? Which I think is something a lot of people ask.
Yeah, basically, it's got 3 distinct names. So Pont Storehouse is one, and that literally translates as bridge to the storehouses, because the bridge known as Jackson's Bridge led you to a group of storehouses on the Georgetown side of the river. And so the whole area leading to the storehouses was known as Pont Storehouse. But then, because of the style of housing and because of the very low level and very uninhabitable housing, not because they were all like below the level of the road or because they were living underneath a certain floor, it was called the cellars because that's generally a term that was given to unfit housing in certain areas of Wales, and certainly a lot of it was below the level of the road and cellar-like and cellar dwellings and things like that. But in general, there was a range of housing there, and the name that it was more often referred to until the 1850s was the cellars, and it only reverted to China, really. We've got one big possible one, but there's lots of debate. I mean, the historian now is no longer with us, unfortunately, because I would have loved to have a debate with him about the name of China. But his name is Keith Strange, and in a lot of his publications, he states that it possibly is something to do with the connections to the Opium Wars and things like that, and China being seen in a particular way at that time in the 1840s and 50s. But that doesn't really hold true, really, because there's no real connections to any Chinese connections or any opium usage in Merthyr at all, none. There's a far more convincing reason that comes in early 1840s, around 1843. There was a reverend who was part of the Wesleyan movement on the Pont Morlas High Street. And he took it upon himself to convert the drunken alcoholism that was rampant in the area, because when you get an industrial town like Merthyr during the 1840s, which was a very difficult decade on every level, a lot of people were flooding you, and a lot of people, general labourers, women left on their own, or parents had died or have randomly just ended up without homes and things like that. They generally will go and turn to crime. There was a famous policeman in Merthyr at the time that said these Welsh, they would rather steal than starve, which I think is a sensible thing to do, to be fair. But in general, they turned to crime when times were hard. But for some reason, this area, the cellars, was known as much more of a criminal district than any other in Merthyr, even though the crime statistics don't really support it massively. But he decided to go in and convert people. He also decided to go in and convert people from their heathen alcoholic ways in Cadraw as well. And so he would hold sermons every Sunday to anyone who was willing to listen, prostitutes, alcoholics, anyone. But he failed severely, unfortunately. And because he was connected to, at that time, he had owned tea rooms, Canton tea rooms and things like that in Merthyr, and he was connected with tea and the temperance movement. He was promoting for them to drink tea over drinking alcohol. And after that, they kind of flippantly called the area he was trying to convert China because of the connections to him and to tea and to things like that. And as random as that sounds, that is literally the best explanation of why China became China that's out there. There is literally none better, really, that I can think of. I still can't see any more in the chat. So is there any more in the chat? So.
Well, picking up on that, Chris, Dylan Foster Evans has posted a blog post from Anthony Rees, the artist and historian, about his theory on why China is China. So thanks, Dylan.
Anthony is great. I met Anthony and I've spoke to Anthony a few times, and the strangest thing in the world happened with me and Anthony is that I told him about the newspaper articles that he was able to uncover and find with that description of, you know, the Wesleyan minister going in and holding services in China. We found it at almost the exact same time. So when I was emailing my friends around the museum and phoning up Ben, who's my colleague, saying, "Oh, I finally figured out why China's called China," he was doing the same, and he was writing a blog as to why China's named China. But his interpretation of the write-up in the paper differs slightly from mine. But again, if you read it yourself, I'm sure there's a connection and a link to it in that blog. Read the original material yourself and then kind of make your own conclusions, really, because the article is not totally clear, but it certainly is the best indication of why it's named China, really, I think.
We've got one other question from Caroline as well. Does the collection have any paintings or objects belonging to Henry Crochet of Oakland's Park, Forest of Dean?
Yes, it does. Quite a few. Yeah, there's one in particular that's painted of his son and his wife Eliza, and that's on display permanently in the dining room in the museum. And it's an amazingly large-scale piece of work, and often it's one of the most talked about paintings within the museum collection because the boy is depicted as a young girl, as quite effeminate, which was often popular to do at the time, really. And I can there's loads of reasons why, but I won't get into the reasoning why because I'll be up for hours explaining the reason why young boys are depicted as girls at certain ages. But certainly Eliza Harris, who would then become Eliza Crochet, who is believed to be a working class girl from Hirwaun who married Henry Crochet, is painted and is featured with her son on display. And we've actually got a small photograph of the painting in situ in Oakland's Park House, and there's various other pieces and paintings that we've got in connection to the family. Not loads by any stretch, but there is there's definitely remnants of them, certainly, and certainly Henry Crochet being such a big part of the crochet story at Kavatha, he is certainly present in our collection, definitely. I'm just looking now to see if it.
I think that's it in the chat at the moment. So
brilliant.
Lots of questions there. Right. So I just want to say thank you very much, Chris, for a fascinating afternoon. It's been absolutely brilliant. I know that the museum's sadly closed at the moment due to lockdown restrictions. Hopefully things will start opening up before too long. But in the meantime, I know you've been busy doing some digital stuff. So what sort of things have you got online from the museum?
Oh well, it's dizzy. As I was saying to you earlier before we started, I've kind of hit it with both barrels, really, and tried to get as much diversity on it as possible. But if you were to go on to our Facebook page, which is Kavatha Museum and Park, Kavatha Castle Museum and Park, and there are a few dummy accounts, so make sure if you don't see my face on a video or two, then it's a dummy account. But certainly follow that and you'll find a lot of things online there. We do videos, we do podcasts, and we share a load of educational resources as well. You can go to kavatha.com to find out a lot about various things as well. But also on YouTube, we are Wellbeing Merthyr, which is the name of the trust that runs us at the moment and manages the building. And they, on their YouTube channel, we have over 65 videos dedicated totally and utterly to the collection of Merthyr. collection of Kavatha Castle, which is the collection of Merthyr, really. And yeah, and so you could certainly pop on there. And we just did one that went out on Sunday. That's all about Richard Trevithick and the myths around the journey that he took in 1804. But yeah, it was it. But hope we will continue that as much as possible, really. And yeah, fingers crossed, we will keep growing and growing our online presence, really. I just don't know how I'm going to go back to a normal job and keep the digital job going now, because they are two different things. But I'll figure that out.
Oh, well, thank you, Chris. It really, yeah, it sounds like you've been really, really busy, and it's great to see so much stuff available digitally. And also in the chat, quite a few thank yous coming through, people having really enjoyed this afternoon. So lots of thank yous coming through there. So I just want to finish things off now by thanking everyone for coming along. It's been great to see such a brilliant audience, and thank you for taking part and posting your questions. That's great. I am going to give a little plug to our next event, which is coming up in at the end of March. So on Monday, the 22nd of March at 2 p.m, Dr. Oliver Davies from Cardiff University's Caer project is going to be speaking on the history of Caer Hill Fort in Cardiff, archaeology, history and community engagement. So if you fancy finding out about some prehistory and archaeology, join us then. Details will be up on our website and on our social media, our Twitter and our Facebook before too long. So have a look there to find out how you can book. But once again, thank you so much, Chris. It's been a brilliant afternoon.
And again, thank you, Rhian and Glamorgan Archives, for allowing me the platform to do it. It's very much appreciated in every way, shape and form. It's lovely to partner up and do a project between the two of us, to be honest. It's great.
It is, it definitely is. And yeah, it's been brilliant to find out more about the castle and about, you know, the museum's home. And yeah, looking forward quite excitedly to see how things are going to develop in future with that as well, and the next stage of Kavatha's life.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Exactly. But thank you so much. It's been brilliant. And thank you everyone for attending. So we'll bring things to a close now. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.